Okay, in this video we're going to focus on the anatomy of the kidney. We're going to look at the superficial anatomy. We'll talk about the sectional anatomy as well. So the first, and he doesn't have a ton of stuff pinpointed on each slide, so we're going to stay on this slide and kind of point out some important features of the kidney here. So the hilum is right here, and you're going to see my finger. The hilum is right here, and that's the site for the exit of the ureter and the renal vein. Is also where the renal artery and the renal nerve enter. So as you move in through this chapter, you're going to see how important it is for the blood to be reaching the kidney and also for the urine to be leaving the kidney. So it makes sense that there's kind of a big opening for both of those to happen. So that is the hilum. And then as this kind of goes down, that goes into the ureter. And then let's take a look at inside this kind of cross section of the kidney for a little bit closer. So outside, all around the outside, you see this cortex, and a lot of these are going to be called renal. That's just the term that goes with kidney, so renal cortex. And then inside is a renal medulla. So this whole thing is called a renal medulla, but then it's broken into these kind of triangle-shaped or cone-shaped renal pyramids, and that's sometimes called a lobe of the kidney. So a renal pyramid, and we're going to see later that the renal pyramids are made up of nephrons, which is what this one box is showing you. But together they're called a renal pyramid, and the blood and urine are kind of filtering through that section together. And so the column, the renal column, is where that kind of divide those pyramids. And then this major and minor calyx, this is the minor calyx is where the urine from this section gets collected, and then it kind of feeds into this major calyx, which is where then all of the urine collects and then eventually goes into the ureter. Again, this seems a little weird to talk about all of this anatomy before we understand what each thing does, but I think once we go through, it will make more sense that each section of the kidney needs to be needs to have the blood flowing through it, because that's going to be its source of the blood that needs to be filtered, but it also has to have a collection of urine that is being produced. So let's take a look at a little bit closer. So this is still basically taking that one square from the last slide, kind of zooming in. And so we are going to talk about the nephron. The nephron is kind of the unit of function of the kidneys, or the basic unit of, well, really function and structure. They are microscopic tubular structures, but they are located in the renal cortex, and there's millions of them. So each kidney can contain 1.25 million nephrons, and you have 2 kidneys. So there is a lot of them, and we will be going through, after we talk about the renal arteries, we're going to be going through and discussing the function of the nephron. So let's look at the blood supply to the kidneys. Now, the kidneys need a lot of blood. They are filtering through that blood, cleaning the blood, as that is their main function. And so they need a lot of blood pumping through all of those nephrons at once. So it does get, the kidneys receive 20 to 25% of the cardiac output per minute. And just to review, that means the stroke volume times the heart rate is the cardiac output. So they are getting a lot of blood pumping through there. And this kind of outlines how the blood gets to the kidneys. It originates from the abdominal aorta and then breaks apart into the renal arteries. And when you dissect in the lab, I'm sure you'll be able to see those renal arteries. They're usually very obvious. The renal artery enters the renal sinus, which I'm hoping in your dissection you'll be able to see the kidney and open it up and be able to see in the renal sinus. And then the renal artery divides into branches from there. And so here's then, of course, where we go into arteries, branching. They're called here interlobar arteries, and they radiate outward between the renal pyramids, so providing all of those nephrons with plenty of blood. After their interlobar arteries, they break apart into arcuate arteries, and they make this arch boundary between the cortex and the medulla, and then each one gives rise to a number of interlobular arteries which supply the cortex. So basically lots of branching, and again, I'm hoping you'll be able to see this in your dissection in the lab, but just realize that every nephron is getting blood supply. From there, the interlobular arteries are branching into afferent arterioles. And here is where, when you look closely at the nephron itself, which you're not going to be able to see in the lab, I'm just talking about on pictures, you'll see the afferent arteriole. So it is important to understand where that blood has come from, how it got from the renal arteries all the way to the afferent arterioles. There's quite a network of arteries in the kidney, but the afferent arterioles is what's bringing the blood to the capillaries which supply individual nephrons. So on a picture of a nephron, you will often see the afferent arteriole. And you can see that on the upper right-hand picture, but again, it's kind of tiny, so you might need to zoom in a little bit. But that's one nephron. And you can see that it is kind of, as the blood goes in on the left-hand side of that one nephron, it's labeled as an afferent arteriole. That's the blood going into the nephron. And then also in that same picture, you can see the efferent arteriole. That's the blood leaving the nephron. And so again, we're going to talk in the separate video about exactly what's happening in the nephron, how the blood is being filtered, and how it flows. But just like before, we're going from arterial to capillaries, but in this case, then after the capillaries, the blood is removed from efferent arterioles. So within the nephron, you see these capillaries, and they're kind of like a net, just like we saw in the respiratory system over the alveoli. And that's really how capillaries are everywhere. It's just a lot of times we kind of take it for granted. But the capillaries, of course, is actually the site of that exchange, just like we've seen in other places in the body. They are actually the spot where they're picking up and delivering substances that are reabsorbed or secreted into this portion of the nephron. And again, in our second video or next video, we'll talk about exactly what's happening in the nephron. But at the capillaries is where substances are being swapped in and out of the blood. Okay, I'm going to leave all of this to the next video, which is going to focus on the function of the kidney.